Immanuel Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, which is from 1784, is one of the most natural places to begin studying philosophy. It's often one of the first essays that I'll have students look at in my introductory course, Basic Philosophical Questions. The reason why it's often one of the best places to begin is, first of all, it's very clear. Second of all, it's very short. Third of all, it kind of establishes in very general terms what philosophy is about, what the sort of questioning process that we frequently prize in philosophy is all about. And it also kind of shows you some of the problems that exist in philosophy, specifically when it comes to questioning, specifically, even more precisely, when it comes to questioning authority. So, we'll take a look at this essay in detail in just a few minutes, but first I want to start off looking at a few biographical details for Kant. So, Kant, first of all, was born in 1724. He passed in 1804. So, he was born, of course, in the 18th century and died in the early 19th. The city that he was born in and lived most of his life in was called Königsberg. It's in present day Russia, although during Kant's lifetime this was not the case. Kant's upbringing was very strict, it was very rigid. He was a member of a religious group, at least during his youth, by way of his parents and their influence upon him, known as the Pietists. And the Pietists were noteworthy for being really rigid in their conception of Christianity, in their conception of authority, and their conception of rules. So again, to reiterate what I said just a moment ago, the Pietists were a religious group that we might think of as exceptionally rigid. Kant's specific family, his household, was in the business of artisanal craftsmanship. His father actually was a producer of horse harnesses. And you see this sort of rigid obedience to authority and also this sort of disciplinary, very strict sort of approach to philosophy reflected in Kant's work. Kant himself was famous for taking a walk every day in Königsberg at the same time. And he was so precise about taking this walk at the same time every day that legend has it, the story goes, that the people in his little town would actually set their clocks by the daily appearance of Kant when he came out to take this walk. Kant, sort of like the modern day academic, had to really struggle and scrap by to make it. You'll see I have there that he tutored to make it by. He did this for quite a while before he really got his name out there, before his work really became well received. And without a doubt, by the way, Kant is one of the most important Western philosophers of all time. The reason why he's so important, you see it there on the slide, is he's famous for writing these three famous critiques. The first of which is probably the most famous, and dare I say the most important. It's called the Critique of Pure Reason. It was released in 1781, and it radically, profoundly reoriented Western philosophy. It was sort of, as you see there, jumping down a little bit to where I've written transcendental idealism, which is the view, the philosophical model or paradigm, if you will, that Kant is famous for and sort of advocated for the first, most succinct time in the Critique of Pure Reason as an alternative to two different previous models or paradigms of philosophy, one of which was idealism, as you see there. I've written in parentheses, exemplars of idealism are Locke, the same Locke who was pretty important to the founding fathers of the United States. I'm sure you've heard that famous line from Locke, life, liberty, and property. Of course, the founding fathers in the U.S. switched that to pursuit of happiness. And also George Berkeley, who is the namesake for the University of California campus, that's generally considered to be one of the best schools in the United States. On the other hand, you had rationalism, which was exemplified by figures that you've probably heard of, Descartes in particular. Descartes, who we will read later this semester, his famous meditations having themselves reoriented radically Western philosophy. And you also have Leibniz, who's probably a more obscure figure. You maybe have not heard of Leibniz. Maybe you've bought before at Aldi Leibniz cookies, which are those little biscuits with chocolate in between. They're very good, actually. You should try them if you have not had them. But I would bet, actually, that you're familiar with some of Leibniz's work, at least if you ever took at the secondary, or as they say, high school level in the U.S., or at the undergraduate level, calculus, specifically differential calculus. Calculus was, as you may know, invented by Leibniz and Isaac Newton, but independently, coincidentally, at the same time. And they actually got into a big fight over who invented it first. And history never really sided with one or the other. They both were very competitive with one another, and it's really rather striking and extraordinary that this idea, this method of solving differential equations came up to two different minds at roughly the same point in time. So Leibniz, of course, was living in Germany, and Newton, as you probably know, was English. So it's not like these two were living next door, had seen each other's work or anything like this. I will add that the notation that we use in calculus today is Leibniz's notation. To this day, that is still the same notation that we use in the mathematics classroom. So what exactly was transcendental idealism, and how was it an alternative to these two other approaches to explaining reality, really, is what we're talking about here? Well, transcendental idealism said that reality isn't, on the one hand, completely outside of you. It wasn't something that was completely external, right? It wasn't something that existed in some sort of dimension that did not require you, did not require your consciousness. But at the very same time, transcendental idealism argued for the first sort of time that it was both true that reality was not wholly outside of you, at the same time as it was also true reality wasn't just inside of your head. Transcendental idealism said there's some third path, there's some third alternative here, and that is that your consciousness, your mind, actively constitutes reality. Without your active involvement in this process, there would be no reality as you know it. So you're probably familiar with the old cliche riddle, if the tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound, right? The transcendental idealist would say absolutely not. It doesn't make sense to even ask a question like this. So we won't be really dealing in the What is Enlightenment essay with this sort of very technical, very honestly pretty complex theory of transcendental idealism for which Kant is so famous, and without which there would be no phenomenology. You may have heard that phenomenology is the big sort of school of thought or school of philosophy that Duquesne is kind of famous for. The only other thing that I want to mention about the biography of Kant is that he was very much influenced by David Hume, famous Scottish philosopher who sort of inspired Kant to radically ask certain questions about things that had been, up to this point in time, presupposed. They'd been taken for granted, in other words. Kant famously says that it was in reading the writings of Hume that he was, quote, awoken from his dogmatic slumbers, right? Dogmatic slumber meaning that he was sort of carrying on unquestioningly throughout his life, taking certain things for granted, and he realized this was a mistake. If you're a student in the sciences, You've maybe heard this famous expression: correlation does not imply causation. That's really arguably a sort of principle that's derived from the writings of Hume. Just to give you an idea of how important Hume is in Western philosophy. So let's go ahead and move on to the essay. I'd first, before we really sink our teeth into the content of it, like to talk about the context of it. Without some understanding of the context, you won't really have a sufficient understanding of what Kant was going for in this short essay, in this paper, really is what it is. So the context is that you probably heard a lot about Enlightenment in secondary school, or maybe even in classes in college. And it's often portrayed to be this really fantastic, marvelous point in time where we sort of woke up and we all of a sudden were acquiring all sorts of new knowledge. We were starting to see the world in a new way. We kind of stepped aside from old ways of viewing the world that were mistaken, that were erroneous, and so on. But there's another side of Enlightenment that often is sort of ignored outside of the philosophy classroom, and that's that Enlightenment very much was something that resulted eventually in crisis. And the reason why Enlightenment was eventually leading to crisis is that philosophers and scientists found that certain things, even in the Enlightenment period, were being sort of set out of bounds. They were being sort of contained in a box where they couldn't be touched, they couldn't be questioned, they couldn't be doubted. And in fact, it was even during the Enlightenment that if you said the wrong thing about God, or you said the wrong thing about Jesus, or even government, right, you could very well be punished with death. So, just to give you a little more context here, you've again to bring in Sir Isaac Newton, who I mentioned was one of the co-developers of calculus. Newton's work made people very confident, very optimistic about what could be achieved with reason, right? And the idea here was that reason could help humans master nature, right? Help them sort of achieve their dominance over it, specifically in a sort of epistemological sense, meaning in the sense of having knowledge that exerted mastery over nature. But importantly, the idea here was also that we were improving our own lives, right? That we weren't just chasing knowledge for knowledge's sake, but there was also something really pragmatic about this sort of knowledge. Now, as you see there, moving on to my next point, Newton's really more of an influence on the Enlightenment and not so much a figure of the Enlightenment itself, right? Meaning he's kind of a spiritual father of the Enlightenment. He kind of started working before the Enlightenment really started getting going. You see, moving down here, that I've given you a list of some authors who are considered to be central figures of the Enlightenment, including Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, who we will read later in the semester, the famous discourse on inequality. And I don't mean to suggest here that every Enlightenment figure was French, although every figure that I've here given you is French. These are just some of the best known figures of the Enlightenment. So let's see more specifically, more articulately, what the crisis was in particular for some of these figures. It was realized eventually, as the Enlightenment carried on, that applying reason to everything, right, universally applying, as I've written on the slide, could eventually lead to some pretty bad consequences. Or maybe we shouldn't say bad consequences, but consequences which some of us would take issue with, so consequences which some of us would determine to be negative. So materialism, fatalism, right? This idea that everything's determined and that you don't really have any sort of free will, that your life is kind of just on a set path dictated by the laws of physics or by who you were born to, who your parents were, where in the world you were born, right? This sort of thing. Atheism, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? The belief that there is no God or that God does not exist. And lastly, simply put, skepticism. But here's the problem, right? You had these sort of negative outcomes that some people took issue with, But at the same time, and I'm quoting here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Enlightenment was not really about overturning traditional moral and religious beliefs. Again, certain moral and religious principles, certain moral and religious doctrines were kind of put in a box, as I said earlier in this lecture. These were things that were considered to be out of bounds, right? So the crisis is that some people started to have an issue with this. Some people started to realize we're kind of limiting the application of reason to things that are convenient to us. We're only using enlightenment to reinforce some of the very dogmatic, some of the very sort of traditional authoritarian ideas and principles that we're trying to get away from. So this is why we call it a crisis, right? The problem was, if we are really honest with applying reason, if we're really honest about thinking critically and asking the right questions, we shouldn't be doing this. So this essay in particular by Kant, What is Enlightenment, is one that very much kind of clears a path for a sort of process of enlightenment that doesn't commit these grave errors, that doesn't draw boundaries, that doesn't say certain things are out of bounds. Now that said, you're going to find in the course of my lecture and in the course of your reading the text that Kant still ultimately does sort of draw a boundary in the proverbial sand, to use an expression that's not literal, right? I'm using a metaphor here. Kant's still going to sort of protect certain spheres of discourse, if I can use this term, away from absolute questioning, away from absolute challenge. And this is one of the big problems here. That said, Kant does take the idea of enlightenment further than some other figures did who existed around the same time. And what's really cool here in this essay is that, in a way, you kind of have Kant prefiguring what would eventually in the 20th century come to be known as existentialism, where meaning and value and significance are things that you come up with on your own. They're not things that are given to you by some authority. They're not things that are sort of determined by someone else and you just have to buy into. They're very much things that you yourself devise, things that you constitute, to use the more technical term that I used a few minutes ago when describing transcendental idealism. So you have this really radically free, this really sort of radical libertarian idea in this essay, and I don't use it in the contemporary idea of political libertarianism, specifically as it's understood in the United States today. At the very same time, though, again, just to reiterate the problem here, you're going to see that Kant ultimately in this paper is going to say, in some situations, in some scenarios, you cannot question, you cannot challenge, you cannot object, you have to obey authority. And that's really kind of the disturbing thing here. That's one of the questions I'm going to want you to reflect on for your weekly writing assignment on this paper. So Kant starts out this paper, though, going ahead and taking a look at the text itself by defining some of his terms. And I'll talk more about this later in the semester when it comes time for you to write your midterm paper, as well as your final paper. But defining terms in philosophy is usually a good idea, right? So when you use, and you'll see this in Plato in a couple of weeks, right? Plato was obsessed with this problem. When you talk about something like justice or beauty or goodness, it's very, very possible, in fact, it's probably not just possible, but probable, likely, in other words, that you mean something else by this term than what someone else might mean. So a way of being really clear in philosophy about what you mean when you use a term is you define the term. And I know sometimes it might seem like sort of stating the obvious, right? It might seem like something that's unnecessary, something that doesn't need to be said. But honestly, in philosophy, there's no such thing as saying something that's too obvious, right? In fact, very often what we want to do is sort of unpack these things that we think are obvious, that we kind of, again, take for granted. So what does Kant define enlightenment as? He says enlightenment is nothing more than exit from immaturity. Depending on what translation of the text you're reading, you might see this alternatively rendered as minority. All right, so minority or immaturity. Kant says enlightenment is leaving this situation, leaving your immaturity, leaving your minority. what is minority or immaturity, right? It has nothing actually to do with age per se, or at least it doesn't have anything to do with age necessarily, right? So we're not talking about immaturity in the sense of crude jokes or adolescent jokes, sophomoric humor, these sorts of things. Instead, what we're talking about is the inability to use your intelligence without the help of someone else, right? So to put it in even simpler terms, the inability to think for yourself. Immaturity is the inability to think for yourself. Enlightenment is when you transcend this situation. Meaning, enlightenment is when all of a sudden you're able to think for yourself. You don't require that aid. You don't require that other party. So you probably are familiar with this expression, the age of reason. Something that's commonly referred to in vernacular American English, right? The age of reason. This point in time where maybe, and again, here I am kind of stepping into the suggestion that this does have something to do with age, but the age at which you're all of a sudden legally treated as an adult, you're maybe subject to certain laws that you weren't subject to as a child or as an adolescent. All of a sudden you can go to prison. All of a sudden you have to do taxes, right? These sorts of things. So the age of reason, right? So this age at which you're able to think for yourself, you're able to sort of clear your own path, you're able to have your own ideas, and you're able to be radically individual about these sorts of things. So, in these first few pages here, Kant gives us a motto for the Enlightenment. He says, the motto of the Enlightenment should be, have the courage to use your own intelligence. So, for Kant, Enlightenment is also going to have something to do with bravery. It's going to have something to do with being willing to give up the sort of guidance, the sort of help that you're maybe used to getting from someone else, and really going out on your own, really thinking freely, thinking for yourself, being open-minded. So one proviso that we should note, one qualification I should say, is that here we're talking exclusively about rational enlightenment. We're not talking about mystical enlightenment, right? The sort of enlightenment that's was the goal or the objective of things like transcendental meditation, right? The Beatles very famously turned to transcendental meditation as a method of finding truths, right? After they honestly got burnt out on too many psychedelic drugs, right? They looked for natural access methods towards the same sort of realizations. We're also not talking about spiritual enlightenment, right? So stepping away from the Beatles example for a moment here, the sort of enlightenment that maybe a monk has, the sort of enlightenment that maybe a priest has. Now, of course, when I say priest, let's stop for a moment here and note specifically the case of the Catholic priest. The Catholic priesthood has always been pretty interesting for the fact that you also have this idea of rational enlightenment, rational argumentation as part of religion. And we'll see quite a bit of that this semester. Quite a few of the philosophers that we're going to read actually are identified or affiliated with Catholicism. And you've probably heard this name, Thomas Aquinas, right, who thought very famously that it could be proven using reason that God exists. So right, this is different, right, using these arguments, using reason from the idea of spiritual enlightenment, where you're either meditating or you're maybe participating in some sort of Catholic sacrament like adoration, where you're acquiring knowledge that's not discursive, right? You're acquiring knowledge that's not logical, it's not rational. In fact, it quite emphatically is often the opposite of that. So we want to be careful here that we don't overinterpret Kant to be commenting on things that he's not commenting upon. So moving on here, still in the first few pages of this essay, Kant says that the majority of people out in the world are led by these people called supervisors. To perceive enlightenment as something that's difficult and something that's dangerous. It's something that's risky. It's something that's scary, right? So you probably are familiar with people who have this same sort of idea about philosophy. I won't assume any of you are philosophy majors, but it's a very common experience for a student to go home and tell her guardians or her parents or whoever, or even a friend, that she wishes to major in philosophy. And people kind of view it with suspicion, right? For multiple reasons. I mean, some people think, oh my gosh, what sort of job are you going to do, or what sort of job are you going to have with the philosophy major, which honestly is a non-problem. You can email me about that if you're interested in those sorts of questions. But also, you have this idea that philosophy can lead people down certain paths. The path of atheism, for example, the path of communism, Marxism in particular, maybe. So people, particularly in the U.S., right? This isn't necessarily the case in France and Germany, and even in Italy, that philosophy is viewed this way. But in the United States, at least, there's a definite sort of suspicion of philosophy. I've told many a person on an airplane that I'm a professor, and they ask in what, and I tell them philosophy, and that's pretty much the end of the conversation. Right? People are sort of either intimidated by it, or they turn off to it. Okay, so who are these supervisors that Kant is talking about? These supervisors who tell us that enlightenment is something that's difficult and dangerous, and something that we honestly, to put it simply, want to avoid. These supervisors are people who are actually very common in your lives, right? These supervisors are authors of books, first of all. Authors of books that you find to be significant. Authors of books in which you find there to be a lot of meaning. So maybe an example of a book that you take to have a lot of meaning that Kant would say is a book written by a supervisor is maybe a book by Plato, right? Maybe it's a book written by some sort of self-help guru. But we don't just have authors of books as the supervisors who are sort of guarding enlightenment. You have also people like priests. You have also pastors, physicians, professors, it could even be argued. Kant says all of these people kind of want you to view enlightenment, radical, free thought, as something that's dangerous, as something that's maybe not possible for you. But Kant definitely condemns this, right? Kant says none of these people are ever going to enable you to find real meaning. They're never going to enable you to find real value. Because real meaning, he says, isn't anything that you're going to get out of a book. Meaning isn't anything that you're going to just be told by someone and just automatically adopt, right? You have to really invest. You have to really critically engage meaning for it to be genuine, for it to be real meaning in any meaningful sense of the term. Kant also here will say an actually pretty cutting edge, pretty impressive comment for his times. Again, this essay came out in the 1700s. Kant says that these supervisors also want all women to think that reason is something that's not accessible to them, right? When he refers to the fair sex, this is who he's talking about. Kant is not a proponent of this, just to be clear. I've had students in the past think that Kant is saying that women aren't able of achieving enlightenment. No, no, no. This is quite the opposite of what Kant is saying. Kant is saying that the system, if you will, right, the sort of people who guard enlightenment want to remove an entire category of people from enlightenment, from the use of reason, right? They want to say that women aren't even capable of doing this. So it's really a sort of proto-feminist point that you see Kant make here. Moving on throughout the essay, Kant will also tell this little sort of story about what he calls dumb animals, and it's a metaphor. And I want to read it to you. Kant writes, after having made their domestic animals dumb, and having carefully prevented these quiet creatures from daring to take any step beyond the lead strings to which they have fastened them, these guardians then show them the danger which threatens them should they attempt to walk alone. Now this danger is not really so great, for they would presumably learn to walk after some stumbling. So the idea here is that we're the dumb animals. We're the dumb animals who are subject to the supervisors, who are kind of like the farmer, the person who is responsible for taking care of the animal. And let's take a closer look at specifically what he's written here, right? First of all, he says that these people want us to think that we need a leash, right? This is what the lead string is to which he refers. We need to be tethered. We need to be fastened. We need to be guided. We need to be led in a certain direction. And these caretakers of the dumb animal, again, the dumb animal being us, the masses, they actually want us to perceive enlightenment as dangerously as possible, right? They want us to sort of think of the idea of learning to swim, right? If you were first shown the water by someone who pointed to a violent sea during a storm and said, yeah, if you're going to swim, you have to swim in that, right? You would probably be very intimidated. You would be very stressed. You would think, gosh, I don't want to even try that. I don't want to try to learn to swim. I'm not interested in this. Now, Kant's saying this is bad, right? This is a extreme sort of example that's used, again, to try to dissuade you, to try to discourage you from wanting to think for yourself, from wanting to be enlightened. And as Kant says here in this quote, the danger actually is not as great as these people want you to think, right? Just like an animal that maybe when it's first born can't right away just hop up and start walking. Of course, some animals can do this, right? We find instead that some animals first stumble, they struggle, they have a hard time. But this doesn't mean that they won't be able to reach the desired outcome. To link this metaphor up to the thought in the essay, that they won't be able to become enlightened, right? Just like, to return to the swimming example, if you first kind of struggle with swimming in a pool or something, this doesn't mean that you won't be able to swim ever, right? It's natural to have some sort of learning curve, as we say, on the way towards your objective, on the way towards your outcome. Now, here's the problem, right? Again, focusing on the metaphor itself. The animal doesn't realize, the animal does not know that the actual danger is not so great, right? The animal is kind of deferring to the owner, deferring to the person who is in charge of her. And as Kant says, examples like this, they do something very specific. They intimidate and they frighten you out of wanting to try, right? They make you want to give up right away, right? And here's the thing, is when you find yourself in a situation like this, it's really hard to break out of, isn't it? It's really hard to transcend this sort of scenario, right? Now, the idea is when you're in a situation like this, when you're isolated, when you're confined, when you're tethered, right, to some sort of authority, it's easy to continue on doing so, right? It's convenient. It's what you're used to. So just like an animal that's used to being walked on its leash, you're comfortable with it. You're used to it. And as Kant says, when it comes to people, we actually enjoy being this way. We actually enjoy not thinking for ourselves. We enjoy being subject to some other person, being led, being told what to think, being told how to think, being told that enlightenment isn't possible for us. So Kant will say, moving on here, that you have sort of little shortcuts, if you will, that are given to us by the supervisors, things like statutes, formulas, and instead of being examples of knowledge, instead of being useful tools of enlightenment, really these are nothing more, he says, than the ankle chains of perpetual immaturity, right? So the idea here is, you can memorize a formula, you can memorize a statute, you can memorize, to use something he doesn't mention himself, but a recipe, right? Kant's saying that's not really the same as thinking for yourself. If you just memorize some sort of procedure or code or shortcut, you're not thinking for yourself. You're not becoming enlightened, right? So that's an important clarification, because I think sometimes we do assume that these sorts of things are valuable types of knowledge. Kant says, no, that's not the case. Now, Kant will next move to an interesting issue here. Kant will say that sometimes you have the supervisor or the guardian reach enlightenment himself, reach enlightenment herself. And what this happens, or what happens when this occurs, I should say, is that this supervisor or guardian desires to help people who haven't yet been enlightened. This person, once enlightened, decides, you know what I was doing was wrong. I shouldn't have tried to control people. I shouldn't have tried to keep people subject to my authority. I shouldn't have tried to prevent people from freely thinking, from using reason, from becoming enlightened, I should say. Now, So first of all, let's note that Kant says when a supervisor or guardian becomes enlightened, this is when this might occur, right? Implying that the rest of the time these people actually aren't enlightened. They're just the people who have the power, right? They're the people who have authority that maybe they shouldn't have. But here's what's really interesting. Here's what's really curious. Kant says, when this supervisor or guardian who's become enlightened tries to reach down and help someone who's a dumb animal, so to speak, the dumb animal actually pushes back. The public, the masses, actually insist to the guardian that they want to continue to be controlled. They want to continue to be yoked, harnessed, right? Again, like an animal. So Kant thinks this is a big danger, right? He's lamenting this. He's condemning this. And it's struggles like this, problems like this, in virtue of which Kant says this is why enlightenment for the public, enlightenment for the masses, is something that happens oh so gradually, something that happens very, very slowly. It is not something that happens instantaneously. It is not something that happens overnight. It is not something, I might add, that happens in a revolutionary manner, right? This is famously what Marx thought would eventually lead to the downfall of capitalism, right? A sudden revolution. For Kant, that's not enlightenment at all. That's not the way enlightenment works. Kant says anything that's rapid and sudden like that isn't really a true reform of the state of mind. So here's really the sort of meat, the sort of most important pair of ideas from this essay. And these ideas are really one of the reasons why this essay is so important and still so useful even today. I encourage you to sort of connect some of these points to contemporary situations in the United States and elsewhere, right? Specifically political situations. Kant talks about two different types of reason, okay? You have on the one hand public reason, and on the other hand you have private reason. Kant says public use of reason is reason that's free. It's reason that's unlimited. It's reason that's not controlled by or subject to an authority or to someone who dominates you or someone who is your boss, right? Now, public reason isn't the only kind of reason. You have also another type called private. I already gave you the name, right? And the reason why we have private reason is that in many contexts, you can't use public reason where you can question anything, where you can challenge anybody, where you can ask whatever you want. Kant realizes that in some situations, in some contexts, you cannot act this way. So, for example, he says a tax agent, right, may disagree with the tax policy, but he or she still has to collect taxes, right? He or she still has to, quote unquote, do her job. The same goes for the priest, right? The priest may have personal doubts about the truths of Christianity, the truths of some other religion. But when this priest is carrying out in his role, giving a homily or a sermon or something like this, it is very inappropriate. In fact, it's illicit for the priest to express these sorts of doubts, right? The priest has to use this other sort of thing called private reason, where you make sure that you obey, right? And we'll get more to that in a few minutes here. Now, the obvious sort of problem here, Kant realizes it. He wasn't blind or ignorant to the issue. Is doesn't this seem to suppress enlightenment? Doesn't this seem to sort of be an obstacle towards the exit from immaturity, as he said? Well, Kant is going to say only sometimes, right? Again, because you're always free to use public reason, right? You may not be free when you're giving that homily or giving that sermon to say, you know what, I think maybe God doesn't exist. I think maybe Jesus didn't exist. But as a priest, Kant thought you can write the newspaper. You can post on your Facebook or on your Twitter saying what you really believe, asking these questions that you think are good ones, right? You don't necessarily have to just go with the flow. You don't have to remain limited, right, to what your boss or what your supervisor tells you to do. So let's look at some more examples and more descriptions of these types of reason. Kant says Public reason is the sort of reason that's used by someone who's like a scholar, right? Talking about an academic, someone who writes for the entire public. So there's a lot of examples of these in the U.S. today, right? You have people who all the time go on maybe the news, or they write to the newspaper, and they're people who are writing for a general audience, and they're maybe saying things that some people don't want to hear. They're saying things that are controversial, things that are unpopular. These ideas maybe are ones that not everyone is on board with, right? So when you're writing for this sort of general audience, right, you can say whatever you want. You don't have to obey anybody. In private reason, right, we have something different. The best way to think about it, and I've already kind of implied this in this lecture, is to consider it in terms of your duty, your role, your job, right? To use the simplest term for this. So maybe you work in an office, maybe you are a school teacher, maybe you're a police officer, maybe you're a soldier, maybe you're a pharmacist, a doctor, a physical therapist, who knows, right? In these situations on the job, right, when you're at work, you, for practical reasons, probably have to limit your reason, right? You can't always challenge things. You can't always question things, right? Unlike public reason, where you've got to be radically free, where you can touch any topic you want. In the case of private reason, you've got to follow orders. Kant thought you have to defer to some sort of authority. You have to defer to some sort of person who's in charge of you. So Kant addresses a few implications, a few interesting sort of issues that may come up. Kant says, first of all, is it possible for a group of people to take an oath, to make a promise, in other words, not to use public reason? Right? This would be like promising never to doubt, promising never to question. Kant says, you cannot do this. This is completely illicit. It's something like a philosophical sin, right? Not a theological sin against God that'll get you in trouble, right? And something that you have to confess or something like that. But instead, something that's sort of like a sin against your nature as a human who has a mind, who has intellect, who has this thing we call the faculty of reason. Kant says, you cannot do this, and furthermore, you cannot do this because you're making a promise for people who aren't even born yet, right? You're making a promise for future generations that they're not going to doubt certain things. It's just impossible. It cannot be done. You can't speak for people in this manner. So as you see, right, I've called it already a philosophical sin. Kant says it's like a crime against human nature. I kind of already said that myself, right? And the reason why it's like a crime is that you're actively and intentionally obstructing or stopping progress, right? You are putting a damper on things. You are getting in the way, so to speak. Now, that's very much an Enlightenment sort of thing to say, right? You cannot block the progress of reason in a manner like this. You cannot prevent other people from acquiring their own enlightenment, right? Now you see, again, to remind you of the crisis that I talked about in the beginning, how interesting it is that Kant sort of takes the idea of enlightenment further than other people were willing to go, right? Kant's saying, using public reason, absolutely you can question God. Absolutely you can question political figures, prime ministers, chancellors, presidents. Absolutely, you can even question in public reason maybe the authority of your parents, right? Let's imagine you had parents who maybe weren't the best role models or something. It would be totally fine, Kant thinks, for you to write an opinion editorial to the newspaper where you sort of talk about your experience and extrapolate from your experience certain conclusions about how sometimes parents can lead us astray, right? They can obstruct our development, our progress, our growth. So he has some concluding thoughts here. Again, these thoughts are kind of addressing implications and issues that his essay brings up. He says, do we already live in an enlightened age, right? Do we live in an enlightened age? Meaning, are most of us today enlightened? Are most of us thinking for ourselves? Are most of us radically free in a philosophical sense, in a rational sense? Kant says no. And remember, he says enlightenment is gradual. It's something that doesn't happen overnight. So he says, we do not live in an enlightened age, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. I know that probably seems to you like something a politician would say, right? A semantic pivot, as we call it. Something like, saying no and then also saying yes at the same time. But all he means here, as I already indicated, is that enlightenment is something that's slow. Enlightenment is something that is going to take a very, very long time. There's not going to be some day that we wake up and just decide, yes, now we live in an enlightened age. Now the majority is enlightened, right? Kant just thinks that's not the way it works, right? We're working on it, but we're not that yet there. Kant will also here at the final few paragraphs of the essay talk about a specific example of a political leader. He talks about a prince, but of course today the same would go for a head of state, a prime minister, a president, or whatever, right? This head of state, Kant says, should let subjects be free when it comes to religion. And Kant says in this essay that's the most important area for people to be enlightened upon, right? Being radically free when it comes to deciding their religion, or their lack of religion, I should add. And Kant says, right, public discussion, public debate, asking these questions, thinking critically, isn't a threat to the political state, isn't a threat to the government, isn't a threat to the Commonwealth, right? It's something that's improving it. Right now, I want you to think maybe on your own the extent to which this is true. If this eventually does lead to revolution, right? Revolution in economic or political sense, like in the sense of Marx, right? That kind of, by definition, is a threat to the political state. So you might want to reflect a little bit on that, whether you agree with Kant on that idea. But as he distinctly says, right, and this is particularly interesting in countries where you have something like a state religion, right, an official religion of a nation, right? People say, you've probably heard people say that in the U.S. it's Christianity. Very controversial to say this, right? That's really not the case according to our laws. And if you look at what a lot of the founding fathers indicated in their writings, a lot of them were actually opposed to that idea. Now today, it's a very popular idea, right? A lot of people think, no, Christianity is the religion of the land, right? So there's a lot to think about here, right? Because Kant says the main point of enlightenment is of the person's exit or release from self-incurred, right? Again, notice that he says self-incurred because you decide to stay this way. The supervisor or guardian cannot force you to remain in this state. But this state that specifically is defined by religious ideas, right? The main point of enlightenment, let me repeat that, is of your release from a self-incurred position of minority or immaturity, primarily in matters of religion. So Kant says, again, I'm on the same page here. He says, you can argue as much as you want, and you can argue about whatever you want. He's talking about the public sphere of reason, where he seems to think religion is the most important thing to debate. But at the same time, it's nevertheless true that you have to obey, right? You have to obey in the private sphere. You have to obey on your job. Think about this too. I mean, this sounds kind of crazy. If your boss tells you to do something you know is wrong, Kant seems to be saying you have to do it because that person is authority, even if you know you shouldn't, right? You can write the newspaper. You can tweet about it. You can make a Facebook post about it. But he says you have to do what this person says. Continuing on with the quote, a great degree of civil freedom seems to be advantageous for the freedom of the spirit of the people, and yet at the same time, it establishes impassable limits, right? Meaning those boundaries I talked about in the beginning, right? And this is the problem, right? As far as Kant goes beyond some other Enlightenment thinkers, he still kind of falls short, doesn't he? He still kind of is establishing a line in the sand, right? These impassable limits, right? That Kant says have to be set in place if we're going to be radically free in the public sphere. So this is the issue here, right? This is the thing I really want you to consider and think about. Is he right about this? Because here's the thing, right? Why should we bother with private obedience at all? Why do we have to keep paying taxes? Why do we have to keep listening to what the priest or the minister says? If there are good arguments out there that draw all of these things into question, right? Why should we keep on holding up the system, right? Why should we remain invested in it if we know better? In other words, isn't it true that public reason is dominant? Isn't it true that, as I've written here on the slide, public reason rules private reason? Kant doesn't seem to think that based on the essay. He gives the private sphere of reason where you have to always obey what you're told to do, right? He gives it a lot of privilege. He kind of protects it. He puts it in the sort of quote unquote safe space, so to speak, right? It cannot be challenged. Is this right? Continuing on with my thought, is he even right about the whole theory overall? Is a priest or even a college professor really free to use public reason if we're preserving private reason? Right? Won't there be consequences for a priest who in the newspaper, who on Facebook speaks out against religious doctrine? For the college professor who maybe even is tenured, right, and says something on social media that his university doesn't like. I'm sure you're familiar with the countless professors in the United States who've been fired, right, for saying the wrong thing. Is Kant really right about this distinction between public and private reason? Or is he kind of idealizing something here, right? Is he kind of optimistically putting these two different types of reason in these categories that he thinks are distinct, but really are rather quite hazy? They're blurry, right? They might blur into one another. This is, again, one of the things I want you to think really, really deeply about. And think also, right, not just the professor, not just the priest or the pastor or the holy person. Think about yourself. Could you write whatever you want on social media? Can you write whatever you want in the local newspaper if it makes the university look bad, right? Won't the university contact you? Won't the university possibly present you with consequences? I think it's quite likely, right? I think there are examples of this happening even at Duquesne, where people have been very upset about students, for example, talking to the media. Students saying things that maybe don't portray the university in the most positive light, right? Again, how is this something that fits into Kant's dichotomy between the public sphere and the private spheres of reason, right? It seems like this distinction isn't as apparent as Kant thought it was, okay? So I want you to think about all of these things, and I want you, of course, this is a very short essay, to read it, right? Don't, throughout the course of this semester, try to rely just on my lecture notes, right? I didn't exhaustively talk about everything that's going on in this paper. And as we go on and start looking at longer texts, starting next week with Plato, and especially later on after the midterm when we look at people like Descartes and Rousseau, I won't be able to talk about everything in the text, right? I won't be able to summarize every last thing. So if you try to rely only upon the lecture, you won't be able to think as deeply about these issues as I want you to, and you won't do as well on your papers, your exams, and even your quizzes and short writing reflections as you would like, okay? Please email me if you have any questions.